The political crisis in Hong Kong at the moment it's uh, it's very saddening, because it really is you can almost see it as a kind of foreboding symbol of what will set the tone of politics, to come in some sense. In as much as the kind of power that China wields and the kind of politics that China is entrenched in, that it has inherited, to a large extent, um, and the very slow work of unraveling, that very convoluted system of political stability or collective societal, sort of um, uh, the problem is that there's so much. The Chinese system is in the long term. One has to hope that the progressive elements within the system they have a long vision. This has always been the promise of the political accountability and responsibility that's been part of the kind of the collective concession which the Chinese political establishment depends on, and threatening that collective concession to the public praise that is given to the political establishment in China. This is what is being threatened by Hong Kong, and this is why it is so fundamentally problematic. Is because one would like to think that the situation in Hong Kong, in terms of its more developed political ecosystem, is something that China is going to sort of incline towards developing as its sort of target. Um, which I would say with the sort of the moral character of liberal democratic Western style politics is has been undermined by the West's own very strange ideological radical which has really defamed the West, and it has really removed the kind of what would have otherwise been the 90s political consciousness of this is, let's just we know what should be happening. There's this sort of we know how progress is going to go, how political freedom works. We understand all these things. All that has been thrown out by the very strange kinds of identity politics, which is anyway. I'm not going to get into the digression about how that's really just proto-fascistic ideology, sort of packaged in a very convoluted and sophisticated sounding, sort of program of dark power, of concentrated power, of authority, the gift to authoritarian demagogues all over the world. But anyway, the shadowy politics of this weird kind of moral authority, which speaks on behalf of the collective and represents the identity that the collective yearns to be given justice to, and so it demands a demagogue. It demands demagoguery. It demands the disconnect of equality before the law. It asks for special dispensations, special measures, a weird kind of anyway, so the paternalism that is demanded by identity politics um, by the political establishment, uh, you wonder. It's really as an open question. You know, the Chinese people themselves on the mainland, they know how. Well, I mean, I don't really know what the real attitude is, and I think to some extent perhaps no one knows, because it's not something that you can openly talk about. It's something that is collectively not something to speak about. So it's just a kind of, you know, I don't think the imagination, I wonder how that imagination is engaged in on people. Well, if we could have dissenting political voices, what would that dissent sound like? You know, um, you know, which is just kind of suppressed by this idea of, well, don't. It's bad luck to hear about it. It's very dangerous to be the person addressing those issues and topics, and speaking about them openly. And there are a lot of people that are willing to inform upon people who do so. And so there's this kind of, so much as there's that culture which is very toxic, and just sustaining the work of sustaining that kind of cultural suppression is itself masking other potential problems. It's sort of, it's putting a lid on something that might otherwise be, a Pandora's box of where democratic politics might go, in terms of mainland China, because it's not merely, democratization does not have liberal values built into it. All fascist societies justified themselves through a kind of legal positivism and speaking on behalf of a mandate substantiated by majority rule, and by majority endorsement or buy-in. So there are a lot of components that is unclear how you ever get to that, apart from actually developing a sophisticated enough critique of authority and power itself, so as to entrench something like a responsible political culture of liberal libertarian values and freedoms. So saying all these trite things is, let me try and say something intelligent. So it's obviously very dangerous for, you can almost imagine that there might be some elements within the Chinese ruling system that is very sympathetic to the resistance against the more autocratic elements, and the sort of the more status quo, and sort of preserving the cultural reproduction of the Chinese state. And it will need to continue to solidify its own power as it becomes more and more internally fragile, as the political involvement in the economy becomes the only way in which the party is capable of keeping hold of its power, and how that level of economic, basically, if you're selling cheap labor, you can have centralized power, and you can have a sort of a simulated big multinational company, or big companies. You can have state-run big companies, because the inefficiencies don't encroach on the what's the word, on the market advantage that is being played upon. But then as soon as you start becoming a middle income country, then you actually have to have the real entrepreneurs and the real business, and maintaining an environment that is capable of sustaining real innovation and real businesses. China is fundamentally hostile to that, with its huge state oligarchy style economic entrenchment and reproduction of its own political, so already it's not obvious, but I think from a strategic point of view, it's obvious that what will become the biggest impediment to China's economic progress will be the political establishment, and how the political establishment reproduces its political power, which will make it all the more paranoid and find it necessary to control the culture and to keep a lid on the sort of the political Pandora's box. And that is very negative, and in some sense Hong Kong is almost like it's not exactly a sign of that particular conflict, but it is like a harbinger. It is at least symbolic of exactly the issue that China faces. Is it going to crush the model of something that is in fact a step up, would be an improvement for everyone? Is it going to dampen its own its own and so when you see someone sort of administering their own affairs poorly, and in the course of administering their own affairs poorly, they have to have secondary concerns that they are forced to contend with because of their own poor administration. And then you have these inconvenient people that are somewhat signaling and sort of drawing attention to the point at which that there's a fundamental mismatch with the public lip service, with the rhetoric, versus the underlying sort of real subtext and narrative, which has to be continually suppressed. So this is a real mouthful just to get to the point of really making the very simple point, where essentially China can't back down. Or, it's an open question. Can China back down? That's really the best way to put it, is can China back down off of Hong Kong and in a sense give integrity and dignity, which is fundamental in the basic law of Hong Kong? Can it cede that dignity to the people of Hong Kong and lose face, essentially? And in so doing, in fact, create a symbol of progress in mainland China. The very backing down and concessions made to the people of Hong Kong, which would in effect shatter their political rhetoric that Hong Kong is being host to terroristic acts. That they are the activists, which by all accounts it seems are representative of the majority of the population of Hong Kong. Who really dislike the political imposition of having their own leaders chosen for them, essentially, and therefore sort of dampening their what was meant to be their separate democratic system, and sort of corrupting their basic law to an extent to which anyone in Hong Kong would be subject to measures and prone to powers that contravene the guarantees that the basic law in Hong Kong provides. So, Hong Kong essentially speaking truth to power, or the people of Hong Kong speaking truth to an entity that is meant to speak for the collective, and that has this, at least in the mainland context, and also wants it in the Hong Kong context, public lip service to be paid in the same way that everyone else is expected to pay the collective concession of praise to the political establishment. So it really does have to do with the theme of democracy, which is at least supposed to be alive in Hong Kong. Which is merely trying to essentially insulate and protect its basic law. Now, the very fine and particular, sort of legalese and the principled, sort of interpretation of this are nuanced, and delicate issues which the rhetoric of China, in its political reproduction of its established system of rule, is not capable of generating a rhetoric that entreats that kind of delicate matter. It's not capable of reasoning on that level without sacrificing its own sort of cultural status quo. If it was, it would then also create the realm in which people could start to debate the very relevance and the utility and the efficacy and the efficiency, and sort of develop an opinion about the course of China, and about what would maximize the interests of China. It would be wonderful if China could essentially redraft its own internal hegemony. The ruling party really needs to find a new way, which is very problematic, because it does not want to lose the purse string. Essentially, China's rule is underwritten effectively by employing most of the population. Most of the population in China, well, maybe it's not even true in an absolute number sense. I believe it actually is, in terms of salaries that are paid. I believe that more money is paid in terms of salary figures. Well, they are definitely the largest employer. I mean, there's no doubt about that. That's obvious. I'm not sure if it's an absolute majority, but it's effectively state-owned enterprises employ, I believe. Yeah, I haven't. It's been a while since I've surveyed these things, but I believe that China effectively employs, and they support, and they offer a lot of good jobs. If you work for a state-owned enterprise, you somewhat, you have room for advancement. You have, there are a lot of middle class. They employ the majority of the middle class, something like that. That is how they. That is how they guarantee their. That no one wants to rock the boat. But that model will become too costly, especially as China gets richer and richer. The art of administration. And the sort of the natural tendency within concentration of power to guard against its own accountability, in essence. And already sort of the corruption in China effectively is not just in blatant corruption. It's in these sorts of structural analyses. It's in these sorts of there is a certain accountability in publicly listed companies. There is competition. There is, the market is sort of sending signals, and there are many different ways in which signals are sent and received. Whereas as China moves into a more and more middle income situation, I mean, the biggest fundamental defects that I see are really that they're not in even the direct financial administration. They're in the institutional facilities, and what I mean by that is like in the legal structure itself. If you don't have a independent judiciary that has a sophisticated enough way of internalizing adaptations and evolving its own jurisprudence in a way in which the methodology itself has a kind of robust integrity that is capable of sort of keeping everything maintained in correspondence and weighing up how these things correspond to one another. I mean, many legal systems actually fail this. There are many. That's why they have to sort of add strange codicils and addendums, and they create a hodgepodge of things to try and have enough, things, and then there's still problems that essentially that then the Parliament has to keep on creating new policy, and the whole thing is just so inorganic. It's so artificial. It's so inauthentic. It's much better when you have something like a common law system that has very good basic principles that are general in their application, and therefore they cover everything, and then you get a bank of jurisprudence that really can keep these things in account, and that when people have problems and controversies, because they have acted with some sense of integrity as to some understanding perhaps in how the law is generally interpreted, they advance the understanding of these issues. In fact, it's the people engaged in contract law themselves, when they come across new and novel situations which they don't know exactly how the law is supposed to work, because no one knows, but they apply their integrity to the best that they can, that the law respects what they have done. It sort of takes into account their intention, and it maps that against the things that need to be taken into account, the things that it needs to correspond with, and they give a certain feedback, and they give a certain level of judgment, and it's in that level of judgment that you actually have a vibrant culture in which people are participating. They are participants. They aren't merely legal subjects. People become legal subjects to the sovereignty and the dignity and the integrity of the energy that people are putting into their lives and into their and people are subject to that. It's not just this top-down directive paternalistic. It's very problematic, because in some sense you've got the people of Hong Kong, these protesters, against someone who by their own rhetoric is the paternalistic, the relationship between the people of China and the government of China, and the relationship between the government of Hong Kong and the people of Hong Kong, these are different ethos. This is a different mental relationship. This is a different everyone knows this. I mean, this is trite, but don't know if I've said anything useful. I guess the most useful thing I've said is, instead of saying China can't concede to the people of Hong Kong, it's better to phrase it as a question. Can China concede to the people of Hong Kong? Can it make a concession? Can it brand itself as a different kind of entity, rather than a sort of a stark paternalistic imposition that essentially banks on the fact that no one will challenge their rhetoric in assuming that role for themselves? Because if they are not able to have that facade be challenged or cracked, then they have to keep forever a lid on discourse, really, on keeping it in a very simplistic discourse that never gets political. That's sort of very essentially just forcing people to avoid topics and just sort of generally concede that they are part of a collective that is powerful and has some kind of prestige that must be going in some positive direction, or it's vaguely positive at least, or it's positive enough, and that there's some kind of collective responsibility within the leadership of China, that at least it will be capable of to some degree refining itself. Now, you see, that's fine at a certain level, but at a certain level you need to have a more sophisticated internal machinery that's capable of having an independent judiciary. And in some sense, this kind of edifice, this kind of superficial facade, is why China can't have strong institutions that have a strong integrity. They will never have, if they can't make the right kind of sophisticated concession, they will never have independent institutional honesty and authenticity that's capable of helping facilitate business functioning in a high level of transparent functioning, and functioning that is open to inspection and invigilation, and sort of keeping track of this. So this is the difference between the opaque society that has to keep its veneer and its facade shiny and looking good, and everyone has to say is only allowed to say how good it looks. So this is this is the difference in how essentially the protesters of Hong Kong are being maligned as mere terrorists, as if they were, as if they weren't representing the majority of people in Hong Kong, and as if the majority of people in Hong Kong didn't realize that their interests, didn't believe already that their interests are being represented by these huge scale protests. And I mean, it is also, it's a sad feature as well that perhaps Hong Kong was being subverted and undermined in a kind of slow way, in order effectively to quash Hong Kong as a model and to make it die out, so as not to potentially in a later stage in which the in which it becomes much more apparent that the political establishment in China is adverse to the progress of China's economy, when that becomes more manifested, that the open discourse in Hong Kong, or at least the idea that people are not just there to be led, but they are the ones providing the value, and or at least they are the ones investing the value of leadership into the authority, rather than authority demanding. It really has to do with the concept of democratic legitimacy, really, essentially. Just the notion of democratic legitimacy is what is being preemptively undermined by China, just sort of to try to quash it and try to remove it from before it becomes somewhat more relevant, or at least I mean, it's, in a sense, it's always relevant, but when it becomes more economically relevant in sort of China's imminent economic sort of position. Okay, well, I guess that's... My recording's always so long, so let me just stop that there. I think I've said the only original idea that I had that I hadn't heard being spoken about by other people commenting on this matter.